Hello and welcome to Unit 8 of Intro to Algebra, Properties of Algebra. So, in this unit, we cover these 5 topics. This includes the commutative property, the associative property, the distributive property, the zero property of addition and multiplication, and the additive and multiplicative identity. So, the first thing we talk about is the commutative property. This property basically just says that when you multiply two numbers, the order in which you multiply the numbers together does not affect the product. So, for example, you see this picture right here. For example, if you see 8 times 2, that's 16, right? You know that's 16. 2 times 8 is also 16, right? This is pretty straightforward. You probably already know this, right? So, 2 times 8 is 8 groups of 2, which is 16, and then 8 times 2 is 2 groups of 8, which is also 16. So, how is this important? Because the property seems pretty self-explanatory, it seems pretty intuitive, but you have to know how to apply it properly. You have to know how to apply this properly. So this property basically just makes multiplying more than two numbers easier to calculate because you can choose the order in which you multiply these numbers. So take this example right here. Multiply 18 times 4 times 5. So if you don't apply the commutative property and you just multiply them in the order they appear, this might take you a little bit of time because 18 times 4, it's not easy to do, especially not in your head. It just takes some time to calculate, right? But if you apply the commutative property, you know that you can multiply whichever numbers you want and still get the correct product. So from here, you can multiply 4 times 5, which you should know is 20, and then from there, you multiply 20 times 18, which is 360, which is much easier to do than 18 times 4, and then that number, multiply that by 5. It's just much easier to do 18 times 20. Okay, now this is another example using the commutative property to alter the expression. So this example basically just says you can use the commutative property to alter the expression to be 4 times 5 times 18 instead of 18 times 4 times 5, because now when you multiply them, you can see it becomes 20 times 18. Okay, the next property is the associative property. This property is very similar to the commutative property, and it basically says that in multiplication problems with more than two terms, you can group terms together and calculate them first, and it doesn't change the property. So it's essentially the same idea as a commutative property. So take this example. When you see 2 times 8 times 3, when calculating this, if you calculate this normally, you first get 16, and then you multiply that by 3, which becomes 48. Now, this expression is also equivalent to 2 times parentheses 8 times 3 because of the associative property. So you multiply 8 times 3 first because it's in the parentheses, and you get 24, and then 2 times 24 is 48, which is the same product, as you can see. Okay, now here's a quick practice problem. Determine whether these expressions are equivalent or not. 4 times 9 times parentheses 3 times 7 times 6, and parentheses 9 times 7 times 4 times parentheses 3 times 6. Pause the video real quick and try and do this practice problem. Okay, so now that you've done the problem, you should get that these two expressions are indeed equivalent. So what you could have done is you could have calculated it and figured out the product, or you could have looked at the associative property and saw that no matter what you multiply first, so basically no matter what's in these parentheses, it doesn't affect the product. And since the values being multiplied are all the same, you can see that the product will be the same. Okay, so how is the associative property useful? So like the commutative property, this idea basically just makes multiplying more than two numbers easier to do in your head because you can choose the numbers you multiply first, right? And this can also be used to determine if expressions are equivalent, which is what you just did right here in this practice problem. So here's another example of that. For example, determine if these expressions are equivalent. 4 times 7 times 5 and 4 times 35. This is pretty simple. You can see because of the associative property, you're able to multiply 7 times 5 first. So 7 times 5 is 35. So 4 times 7 times 5 is indeed equivalent to 4 times 35. The next idea is the distributive property, which basically just states that for expressions that look like a times parentheses b plus c, or something like a times parentheses b minus c, instead of having to calculate what's inside of the parentheses first, like what you would normally do in like PEMDAS, you can distribute a to each term inside of the parentheses. So basically, if you take a times parentheses b plus c, this becomes ab plus ac. So this property is useful for expressions that involve variables in the parentheses because, like, obviously you can't add or subtract the values inside the parentheses. You can't do anything more in that situation. So yeah, so let's say if we were to have an example in the form a times parentheses b minus c, and c was equal to x, and b is 3, and a is, let's just say, 2, then you can't do 3 minus x, right? Because you don't know what x is. But what you can do is simplify this equation by distributing a to each term. So this becomes a, which is 2 times 3, minus 2 times x, which is 6 minus 2x. And you can distribute this and make this expression more simplified. So try to do this example. So you have 4 times parentheses 3 plus 2. So in order to solve this using the distributive property, you multiply each term in the parentheses by 4, right? This is pretty straightforward. So 4 times 3 is 12, and 4 times 12 is 48. So you have this, and then you can add it together to get 60. Okay, now here's a little bit more practice on the distributive property, because this is like, the first two properties were pretty simple, so I felt like they didn't require that much practice. This is the first property that might be a tiny bit confusing. So here's some practice. Just go ahead and do these practice problems. Okay, now that you've done the problems, here are the answers. You can just check them real quick. I'll do a quick overview of them. They should be pretty straightforward though. So you see 3 times parentheses 4 minus 9, that just becomes 3 times 4 minus 3 times 9, which is 12 minus 27. Solution to number 1. 5 times parentheses x plus 3. You see, this is a question with variables. You physically can't add these two numbers together inside the parentheses. So you have to use the distributive property in order to simplify the equation. So this becomes 5x plus 15, 5 times x plus 5 times 3, 5x plus 15, right. 2 times parentheses a plus 3b. Once again, this has variables, so you have to apply the distributive property. So this becomes 2 times a plus 2 times 3b, which is equivalent to 2a plus 6b. That's right. Next, does this equation show the distributive property? A plus b plus c is equivalent, parentheses a plus b plus c is equal to a plus parentheses b plus c. Does this show the distributive property? Now, if you were paying attention, you would know that no, this in fact does not show the distributive property, because this actually shows the associative property, which is basically just grouping up these terms together, right? This reflects the idea of the associative property. This does not show the distributive property. So no. And then you have this, solve for x. So you can see we have a full equation here. You apply the distributive property to this. This becomes 3 times x plus 3 times 2, which is 3x plus 6 is equal to 15. You have a simple equation, and then when you solve this equation, you get 3x is equal to 9, and then x is equal to 3.